I was reading something this morning and it caught my attention. A Republican Texas state representative making a statement in regards to a bill that was in order to fight against critical race theory. And what caught my attention, and which I will talk about in just a little bit, the notion of the critical race theory, but rather the justification behind rejection. And of course, as it is quite common, it was done with referencing of Martin Luther King Jr. and specifically talking about that the person should not be judged by the color of their skin, but by the content of their character. It is a great saying, and of course, but my personal favorite saying by Martin Luther King Jr. is actually that the morality cannot be legislated, but the behavior can be regulated. He says that in his speech, Other America, in '67. And it may be true that the law cannot change the heart, but it can restrain the heartless. And so while the law may not change the heart of man, it can and it does change the habits, right? And so when we talk about it, we need to be able to understand how the critical race theory comes into play in being able to do the following. And here's the interesting thing, or at least I find it that to be interesting, understanding of what critical race theory means. Certainly when we talk about the 5 planks or premises of understanding of centrality, intersectionality of racism, and being able to challenge the dominant ideology, understanding of the social construct, the narration and the storytelling, and certainly the affirmative actions and destabilization and the use of thereof can all plays an important factor in understanding critical race theory. But this isn't the point that I'm trying to make. The point I'm trying to make is understanding what critical theory represents, which is an assessment, a critique, if you will, a challenge to the power structures, right? Like that's what critical theory is. And what does race mean? Well, race means, well, it means the classification, right, of humans into groups based on physical and or social relations, which is quite interesting. We almost always use the physical one, and we forget that that the social relations also play an important part in being able to identify racial characteristics. And certainly when we look at those notions of those who are trying to challenge the status quo of the power structures that are in positions of power and those who are rejecting it, then all of a sudden it becomes very, very simple to say, wait a second, if we are not challenging, if we are not changing those structures that are existent, then are we then embracing them and saying that they are normatively okay and or benign to everybody? And here's the reality. It would be very difficult for people to say otherwise because, well, the reality happens to be is the exact same premise of the rejection of, for example, Black Lives Matter movement, because then the response is, no, I do not reject the Black Lives Matter movement because I embrace all lives matter. But all lives are not being prosecuted or hurt or brutalized by the police when they are being stopped, whereas specifically Black lives are being affected. And so in being able to embrace that premise, in challenging the power structures that are putting certain people into the underprivileged position, is essentially what is behind the notion of the critical race theory. And see, here's the more layered level, is that the problem isn't necessarily that those who use it are misusing it, because it is quite very well could be that even those individuals who profess that they are in support of the critical race theory are unfortunately and or purposely are utilizing it in such a way so as to be able to, or because of either their not complete understanding of what the intent behind it is, or because of their willfulness, they create more chaos, which means both people who are fighting against the critical race theory and unfortunately those who are championing it have a lack of understanding of what it represents and how it needs to interact with one another. And part of that has to do with willingness for people to be able to understand that even those who are claiming to be in a position of the critical race theory is just a challenge to the existing premise and utilizing it in order to be able to change the problems that we have within our society is not or ought not to be in any shape or form problematic unless you're willing to stand out and say there is absolutely nothing wrong with our society. Well, then that would probably be very, very difficult thing to do. And secondarily is to say that there are no inequities that are persistent within our society, and that certain groups and certain individuals are not denied access to any wide number of things. And if that is the case, then all of a sudden, and even more so, you would be, especially if you're willing to fight for our fellow human beings, because intersectionality and more importantly, the centrality of how we interact with one another is the cornerstone of how it leads to the problems. Like, for example, color blindness or the notion of not seeing race is essentially what could be problematic when you are characterizing in being able to divide between the task versus the individual. In other words, if you are being operated upon, you want the best surgeon, and that best surgeon who's operating on you will not in any way, shape, or form be relevant to their racial identity. But when you are denying for individuals to go into the med school, specifically because of their racial identities, you are going to frame your ideology in expectation that is going to be plagued by both stereotypes and massive self-fulfilled expectations that are going to lead to pushing certain people from being able to be in certain spheres. And certainly when one would say that there is utilization of the race as a social construct, and unfortunately that's the reality, that the social construct of racial relations is what creates and pushes upon us an ability for a majority of people to be able to function within the society in which there are rules that are going to mean that certain individuals are going to be denied true access. And a response, well, everybody has equal access, is not even a conversation about equity and equality, but rather reality, which means, wait a second, if there are no opportunities that are, and rather indirectly and sometimes even directly, there is a quite the polar opposite, which is there are barriers for certain groups to be able to engage in all areas of society, then we understand why we need to be able to implement the critical race theory, because the way to confront it is not by basically looking at the simplified numerics, but rather in understanding in how the lived experiences of certain groups are denied being able to be aired simply because of their lack of values that are unfortunately are perceived to be of worth, which almost forces one to think about pedagogy of the oppressed and the Freirean notion of banking, the system of education, of how the value is placed. And again, that would be a critical thought. Essentially, at the end, when we talk about the critical thought and we think about critical race theory, the problem isn't in the critical race theory. The problem is in not allowing it to be able to challenge the existing power structures, because the existing power structures will fight tooth or nail to prevent it from being able to be heard.